The most dangerous lie told in that dining room was not shouted. It was spoken softly, in German, in the warm, professional voice of a man everyone in the room had been paid to trust. It slid into the conversation between a sip of reserve Riesling and a compliment about the city skyline, dressed up to sound exactly like the truth. Nobody at that table caught it. Nobody important, anyway. Only the woman refilling the water glasses heard it land. Her name was Annalise Brandt, and on the evening of October 9th, she was not supposed to matter to anyone in the Ironwood Room. The Ironwood Room sat on the 14th floor of the Arden Moor, a restored 1920s hotel on the Ohio River in downtown Cincinnati, the kind of place where the windows ran from floor to ceiling and the river below looked like poured pewter under the streetlights. The dining room had been designed to make wealth feel quiet. The tablecloths were the color of bone. The light came from low brass fixtures that flattered everyone and revealed nothing. A pianist played something gentle near the far wall, and the whole space smelled faintly of cedar smoke and seared butter and the cool mineral scent of money that does not need to announce itself. A suite upstairs ran $812 a night in the slow season. The river kept moving. The room held its breath. At 6:47 that evening, a man stepped off the elevator alone and looked to the hostess like a problem she would need to solve gently. He was tall and lean, somewhere past 50, with dark hair that needed a cut and a few days of beard he clearly hadn't thought about. He wore a faded charcoal hoodie under a worn brown leather jacket that had seen real weather, dark jeans gone soft at the knees, and motorcycle boots that had been resoled more than once. A small canvas bag hung off one shoulder. No watch, no tie, no lanyard, no briefcase, no logo announcing which firm had sent him. He moved without hurry, the way a man moves when he has nothing to prove, and therefore proves everything, and he gave the hostess a small, tired, genuine smile that she did not quite know what to do with. His name was Keanu, and the German group he had flown in to meet did not know his face. That was the entire point. 2 years earlier, when a precision engineering firm in Stuttgart called Heilmann Precision GmbH had begun courting Arch Motorcycle for a co-development deal, a limited run of hand-built machines using a new forged titanium frame process, the talks had been handled through representatives. Keanu had asked, in writing, that his name stay off the early documents. He wanted to watch the partnership form the way a customer would watch it, honestly, without the room rearranging itself around him. He had co-founded Arch, with his hands, as much as his money, in a workshop where everyone wore the same grease, and he had learned a long time ago that the truest measure of a company is how it behaves when it thinks no one important is in the room. So tonight he was, on paper, a technical consultant, a quiet man in a leather jacket who had come early to listen. He gave the hostess the name on the reservation, and her smile recalibrated half a degree, and she walked him toward a private corner of the room where 2 men were already waiting. The first was Stefan Brunner, the German delegation's lead engineer, broad-shouldered and careful, a man who shook hands as though he meant it. The second was the problem. His name was Roland Price, and he was the interpreter. Price was 44 and dressed like a man who had decided, long ago, that other people's respect was a thing you could manufacture through tailoring. His suit was a deep midnight blue, cut close, and his shoes had been polished to a shine that caught the brass light. He had a firm handshake he held 2 seconds too long, and a habit of looking at a person's clothes before their face. When Keanu approached the table, Price looked at the leather jacket, the soft jeans, the resoled boots, and arrived at his conclusion before a single word had been exchanged. He did not stand. He did not offer his hand. He gestured, with 2 fingers, at the chair farthest from the center of the table. "You can sit there," Price said. "Mr. Brunner and I will handle the substance. If we need anything technical clarified, we'll let you know." Keanu sat where he was told. He set his canvas bag at his feet. He said thank you, and he meant it, and Price's mouth tightened slightly, the way it does on a man whose contempt has not landed. "Here is what you should hold onto as this evening unfolds. Watch the interpreter. Watch how a person who has decided he is the smartest one in the room behaves toward the person he has decided is the least important. Because that gap The distance between what Roland Price thought he knew and what was actually true is the whole story. The German principals arrived at 7:09. There were three of them, led by Wilhelm Adler, the chairman of Heilmann Precision, a silver-haired man of 70, with reading glasses and the unhurried gravity of someone who had signed a great many things and regretted only a few. He greeted Brunner warmly, nodded politely at Keanu without registering him, and took the seat of honor with his back to the river. The negotiation began, and from the first minute, Roland Price took it over. He sat himself at the conversational center, leaning forward, translating with a fluency that was genuinely impressive and a confidence that was something else entirely. When Adler spoke in German, Price rendered it into English for the arch side. When the arch consultant, Keanu, asked a question, Price translated it into German, or said he did. He interrupted. He summarized. He compressed long, careful German sentences into short, reassuring English ones, and he did it all with a smooth, professional smile that made everyone feel the deal was gliding toward a happy conclusion. Keanu listened. He didn't speak much. He turned his water glass a slow quarter turn on the cloth and watched the way Price's translations got shorter exactly when the German got longer. He didn't speak fluent German. He had picked up a few dozen words across years of work with European suppliers, enough to order coffee, and read a Torque spec, not enough to follow a contract. But he had spent his whole life learning to read rooms, and something in the rhythm of this one was off. When Adler frowned and spoke for a full 30 seconds, weighing each word, Price would turn and say, in English, he's happy with the timeline. When Brunner asked a long technical question, Price would answer it himself, in German, without waiting, and the answer would arrive too fast to have been considered. Keanu made a small note on the corner of a paper napkin. He did not say anything. Not yet. Anneliese Brandt had been watching that table for an hour. She was 26 years old and had worked at the Ironwood Room for 11 months, long enough to know that the best servers were the ones the guests forgot were there. She had grown up over the river in Covington and then in Cincinnati's old German neighborhood, over the Rhine, in an apartment above a bakery that had been in her family for 3 generations. Her great-grandmother had come from Bavaria with 2 suitcases and a recipe box. Her grandmother had raised Annie in a kitchen where the radio played in English, but the serious conversations, the ones about money, about illness, about whether the bakery would survive another winter, always switched to German. As a child, Annie had understood, without anyone explaining it, that German was the language her family used when something mattered. When the words came out hard and short and the silences stretched long, she knew not to ask for a cookie. She knew to sit still and listen. She had never thought of it as a skill. It was just the sound of her childhood, the sound of things that were true. So when she carried the Riesling to that corner table and bent to fill the chairman's glass, and Wilhelm Adler said something low and careful in German to his colleague, Annie heard it the way you hear your own name in a crowded room. She didn't mean to. She just did. He said, with the particular weight her grandmother used to use, something about a clause, about control, about what happens if there is a disagreement. She straightened up, set the bottle down, and walked away, with her heart suddenly loud in her ears. She told herself she was imagining it. People do that. They hear a fragment of a language they barely use and build a whole story around it. She went back to the service station and folded napkins that didn't need folding because her hands needed something to do. The dining room hummed on around her, indifferent, beautiful, expensive. At the corner table, Roland Price laughed at his own joke, and the chairman did not laugh, and Annie noticed that too. She went back twice more over the next half hour. Each time, she heard a little more. The third time, there was no mistaking it. Adler was explaining a clause, slowly, the way you explain something you want to be very sure is understood. He used a word Annie knew well, a word that had lived in her grandmother's mouth, a word that did not appear in pleasant conversation. It meant forfeit. It meant that, if the partnership ran into a defined kind of dispute, decision-making authority over the new design, the frame process, the thing the whole deal was built on, would transfer, for a fixed period, out of Arch's hands. Adler was being honest about it. He was a fair man laying a hard term on the table, because that was the right thing to do. And Roland Price turned to the arch side and translated it as a standard arbitration provision, nothing unusual, just boilerplate. Annie felt the floor tilt. She set down the plate she was carrying with great care because her hands had started to shake. Now stay with this, because what happened next did not happen quickly. It would be a cleaner story if it had. The truth is that Annie Brant stood at the edge of that dining room for the better part of 20 minutes and did nothing, and the doing nothing cost her more than anything she would do later. She thought about her job. She thought about the rent on the apartment above the bakery and the $6,318.47 her younger brother still owed on his first year of trade school, a number she had memorized because she was helping him pay it. She thought about what happens to a server who interrupts a private executive dinner to accuse a paying guest of fraud. She thought about how it would sound. A waitress. A few words of half-remembered German. Against a credentialed professional in a midnight blue suit. Who would believe her? She didn't even fully understand the contract. She understood a tone. She understood the difference between the way a person says a thing they mean and the way a person says a thing they are trying to slide past you. And she understood, standing there with a tray going cold against her arm, that she was the only person in that room who could hear it. Roland Price, meanwhile, had noticed her. He had noticed the way the server kept drifting back to the table. He had noticed her slowing near the chairman when the German got dense. Price was not a stupid man. That was the tragedy of him, and a small cold instinct in the back of his mind registered the waitress as a variable he did not control. So he did what men like Roland Price do when they sense a threat from below. He moved to remove it. He caught the eye of the floor manager, a tense man named Gerald Voss, and beckoned him over with the same two-finger gesture he'd used on Keanu's chair. He spoke quietly, smoothly, in the reasonable voice of a man protecting a delicate situation. The server, he explained, was hovering, lingering, making his German guests uncomfortable during sensitive talks. He would appreciate it if she could be reassigned, and if the unaccredited gentleman in the leather jacket, he tipped his head at Keanu, without looking at him, could perhaps wait in the lounge, since the substantive portion of the evening really didn't require a consultant, and the chairman valued discretion. Gerald Voss had a mortgage and a manager's instinct for which guest to please, and he made his choice in under 3 seconds. This was the breaking point. This was the moment the evening turned from awkward to wrong. Voss came to Keanu first, apologetic, hands slightly raised, and explained that the private party would prefer to continue with just the principals, and would the gentleman mind terribly waiting in the lounge? They'd send for him if needed. It was a humiliation delivered in the gentlest possible packaging, and everyone within earshot understood exactly what it was. A man in a leather jacket, asked to leave the room because he didn't look like he belonged in it. The chairman didn't object because the chairman assumed the interpreter knew the protocol. Brunner shifted uncomfortably and said nothing because Brunner outranked no one. And Keanu, who could have ended the entire charade with a single sentence, who owned a controlling stake in the company everyone at that table was negotiating to partner with, simply nodded, picked up his canvas bag, and stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for a card. He had spent his whole life refusing to make other people prove they were worthy of his honesty before he extended it, and he was not going to start tonight by demanding they recognize him. Of course, he said. I'll be right outside. Roland Price permitted himself the smallest smile, and then Voss turned to find the server, to reassign her, and Annalise Brandt understood that her window had just closed, and that if she let it close she would lie awake every night for a year wondering what she had let happen. So she didn't let it close. As Keanu crossed the dining room toward the lounge, bag over his shoulder, moving past the service station, where she stood, Annie stepped into his path. Not dramatically, just enough to slow him. She picked up a water pitcher off the station, so that to any watching eye she was simply a server topping off a guest, and she leaned in close, under the cover of the gesture, and she said 4 words, low and clear, in English, only for him. Your translator is lying. She didn't explain. She didn't repeat it. She didn't wait to see his face. She set the pitcher down, turned, and walked toward the kitchen, with her chin level, and her hands cold, and her whole body braced for the world to end. Behind her, she heard nothing. The piano kept playing. A fork touched a plate somewhere. The river kept moving in the dark beyond the glass. But the man, with the bag, over his shoulder had stopped walking. He stood very still for a moment, the way a person stands when a single sentence has rearranged the room around them. He did not look back at the table. He did not look at the waitress. He simply changed direction, away from the lounge, toward the elevators, and he took out an ordinary, slightly scuffed phone, and he made a call. He did not call security. He did not call a lawyer to make threats. He called Gard. Gard Hollinger had co-founded Arch Motorcycle with him in a Los Angeles workshop more than a decade earlier, and he answered on the second ring with the easy bluntness of a man who had been answering this particular friend's calls for years. Keanu spoke for under a minute, low and even, in the lobby outside the dining room. He explained where he was. He explained, without heat, that the interpreter on the Heilmann deal appeared to be misrepresenting the German side's terms, that he'd been quietly tipped off, and that he wanted two things by morning. He wanted an independent certified translator pulled in to review every document and, if possible, the recorded audio of tonight's session. And he wanted a quiet background pull on Roland Price and Price Linguistic Solutions. Every prior client, every prior deal. You sure? Gard asked. I'm sure, Keanu said. And Gard, there's a server here. Brandt, I think the tag said. She's the only reason I know. Don't let her get lost in this. He hung up. He put the phone back in his pocket. And then he did something that, to the hostess watching from her stand, made no sense at all. He walked back into the dining room, crossed to the corner table, and sat back down in the chair Roland Price had assigned him at the far end. Quietly, without explanation. Like a man who had decided to stay after all. Price's smile flickered. I thought you were going to wait in the lounge, he said, in English, pleasant as a blade. I changed my mind, Keanu said. I'd like to hear the rest. What followed was the slowest hour of Roland Price's life, though he didn't know it yet. Keanu started asking questions. Small ones. Polite ones. He'd let Adler finish a long German passage, and then, before Price could translate, he'd say, gently, could you ask him to repeat just that last part? I want to make sure I have it. And Price would have to ask, and Adler would repeat, slowly, and Keanu would nod, and write something on his napkin, and ask another small question. He didn't accuse. He didn't argue. He just kept asking the German side to say things twice, and then a third time, and with every repetition the gap between what Adler said and what Price translated grew harder to paper over, because the chairman was a precise man who used the same words each time, and Price was a fluent man who kept reaching for new ones. Sweat appeared at Roland Price's hairline. He loosened his collar. He drank his wine faster. He began, for the first time all evening, to translate less, to leave things out, to keep his renderings short, as though the fewer words he said the fewer could be checked. Wilhelm Adler, who had built a 70-year-old firm on the principle that good faith is the only currency that doesn't inflate, began to frown. At 8:14, Keanu closed the napkin he'd been writing on, folded his hands on the table, and said, in slow but unmistakable German, 3 words he had practiced quietly in the lobby, 3 words a man can learn in a minute when he needs them. Bitte, noch einmal. Please, once more. The table went silent. Adler turned to him, surprised, and answered in German, and Keanu held up a finger and said, in English now, to the whole table, I think there's a difference between what Mr. Adler is saying and what's being translated. I'd like us to pause and bring in a second interpreter before we go any further. Tonight, if we can. It was not loud. It did not need to be. In a room built to make wealth quiet, a quiet sentence carries the most. Roland Price did the only thing a man like Roland Price knows how to do. He doubled down. With respect, he said, and the respect was sandpaper. I've been a certified interpreter for 19 years. I've handled deals 10 times this size. I don't know what you think you heard, and I'm not sure why we're taking the word of. His eyes flicked involuntarily toward the kitchen door, but my translations are accurate. They are professional. I'm protecting this deal from getting bogged down in technicalities that a layman wouldn't understand. That is literally my job. I understand, Keanu said. I'd still like a second interpreter. That's an insult to my credentials. It's a request to check the work. Good work survives checking. Price's jaw worked. He looked, for one moment, like a man standing at the edge of a thing he could still walk back from. And then his self-righteousness, the absolute, load-bearing certainty that he was the competent one and everyone else in that room was a fool to be managed, chose for him. Fine, he said, standing, buttoning his midnight blue jacket. If you want to torpedo a perfectly good agreement over paranoia, that's on you. But I won't sit here and be accused. I've done nothing but my job. He looked at Adler and said something quick in German, something that was, the certified interpreter would confirm the next morning, a final small lie, a claim that the arch-consultant was unwell and the meeting should reconvene later. Then he walked out of the ironwood room, with his chin up and his certainty intact, and he never once considered that he might be wrong, because Roland Price had never in his life considered that he might be wrong. The chairman watched him go. Then he looked at the quiet man in the leather jacket, who had asked, 3 times, to hear the truth said again. And something in Wilhelm Adler's old, careful face changed. The next morning moved faster than any of them expected. By 9:30, the independent translator guard had arranged. A court-certified professional named Deborah Reuter, who had no connection to anyone in the deal, had reviewed the contract and a recording of the prior week's session, captured for the Archside's records. Her findings were not a matter of opinion. In 4 separate places, the German source said one thing, and Roland Price's verbal English said another. The clause about decision-making authority, the one Adler had laid honestly on the table, had been softened in Price's mouth from a serious transfer of control into standard boilerplate. It was, Reuter wrote in her sober professional language, not an error of skill. A man of 19 years' experience does not accidentally translate forfeit of control as routine arbitration. It was a choice, made repeatedly, in one direction, toward the interests of someone other than the client. By 11:23, the background pull had come back, and the word that came back with it was the one that mattered most. Recurrence. This had happened before. Roland Price had a history, and the history had a shape, and the shape was always the same. A complex deal in a language his client couldn't check, a few key clauses softened or omitted, and a quiet benefit flowing somewhere it shouldn't. There were 3 people, in particular, whose names rose to the top of the file, and over the next 2 days, as Keanu's people made careful calls, those 3 people agreed to put what had happened to them on the record. The first was a man named Harold Vesper, 68, who had spent 30 years building a furniture manufacturing company in Grand Rapids, before a partnership deal with an Austrian supplier, interpreted by Roland Price, went catastrophically sideways. A clause Vesper had been told was protective turned out to be the opposite. He'd lost controlling interest in the company that bore his own family's name. He had assumed for 6 years that it was his own failure. When Deborah Reuter walked him through the original Austrian documents, over the phone, line by line, Harold Vesper was quiet for a long time, and then he said, in a voice that had carried a wrong weight for 6 years, so it wasn't me. The second was a junior interpreter named Diane Coyle, 31, who had worked one assignment alongside Price early in her career and had flagged, in writing, a translation she believed was deliberately misleading. She had been told she was inexperienced, oversensitive, not a team player. Within a month she had been quietly dropped from the agency's roster, and the reason given to anyone who asked was fit. She had nearly left the profession. She had kept her email flagging the discrepancy for 4 years, in a folder she could not quite bring herself to delete. The third was an elderly importer named Eleanor Frommer, 72, who had been openly belittled by Price at a contract dinner. She kept asking what words meant. He had reportedly said to the room, as if I have time to run a language class, and who had signed, on his assurances, an agreement that cost her the better part of her retirement. She did not have documents. She had something the documents couldn't hold, which was the exact memory of how it felt to be made small by a man in a good suit, while everyone at the table laughed, and she was willing, at 72, to say so out loud. 3 people, 3 rooms, 1 pattern, and in not one of those rooms had anyone, with the power to stop it, bothered to check the quiet voice against the loud one. The consequences for Roland Price arrived the way consequences usually do, slowly, and then all at once. Hallman Precision GmbH formally suspended all dealings that ran through Price Linguistic Solutions and notified two professional interpreters associations attaching Deborah Reuter's findings. The associations, presented with documented, repeated, directional misrepresentation, opened a review that ended 4 months later, with Price's certifications revoked. The recording from the Ironwood Room, combined with the Vesper and Frommer documentation, became the spine of a civil fraud action that drained Price's accounts faster than his outrage could keep up with. His firm dissolved. His clients, every one of them, found other people. The midnight blue suits stayed in the closet because there was nowhere left to wear them. And through all of it, through the depositions, the revocation hearing, the slow public unwinding of 19 years of manufactured authority, Roland Price never once admitted that he had done anything wrong. He said it was a witch hunt. He said the second translator had an agenda. He said the standards of the profession had been corrupted by oversensitivity, that he had always operated within accepted norms, that the real problem was a culture that would take the word of a waitress over a credentialed expert. He said all of this in a deposition, on the record, with his career already in ashes around him, and the lawyer taking the deposition later told a colleague that in 15 years she had never seen a man so completely certain he was the only honest person in a story about his own dishonesty. He went down the way self-righteous men always go down, not pushed, refusing, to the last, to step away from the edge he was standing on. But that is not the part of the story worth remembering. The reckoning rarely is. The part worth remembering happened on a quiet Tuesday 11 days after that dinner, when Keanu walked back into the Ardmore, not the dining room this time, but the lobby, and asked at the front desk whether a server named Annalise Brandt was working that afternoon. Annie had spent 11 days waiting to be fired. She had heard, the way staff always hear things, that the German deal had blown up, that the interpreter was gone, that there had been lawyers. She had assumed the silence around her own role meant the worst kind of trouble was simply taking its time. She had kept showing up to her shifts, kept folding napkins, kept moving through the dining room, as invisibly as she could, and she had told no one what she'd done, not even her grandmother, because she could not yet tell whether it had been brave or stupid. When the floor manager told her there was a gentleman in the lobby asking for her by name, her stomach dropped through the 14th floor. She found him near the windows, in the same leather jacket, with the same canvas bag, looking exactly as out of place in the marble lobby as he had the night she'd warned him. He turned when she approached, and he smiled, that same tired, real smile, and he put out his hand. "I never got to thank you," he said. "I'm Keanu." "I know," she said, before she could stop herself, and then, flustered. "I mean, I didn't that night. I didn't know. Who? I just heard the German, and she stopped." "Am I in trouble?" "No," he said. "You're the opposite of in trouble." He told her what had happened, plainly, without making it a performance. He told her about the second translator, about the 4 altered clauses, about the word recurrence, about Harold Vesper finally learning it wasn't his fault. He did not dress it up. When he was finished, Annie was quiet for a moment, and then she said the thing that told him everything he needed to know about her. "I almost didn't say it," she said. "I stood there for 20 minutes. I keep thinking about that. Not the part where I said it. The 20 minutes where I didn't." "That's the part everyone gets wrong," Keanu said. "They think courage is the moment you speak. It's not. It's the 20 minutes. It's deciding the silence costs more than the risk. Most people never finish the math." He paused. "You finished it." He asked her how she'd learned the language. She told him about the bakery, about her grandmother, about the way German had always been the family's language for the things that were true. He listened the way he had listened to Wilhelm Adler, completely, without checking his phone, as though her ordinary history were the most interesting thing in the building. And then he made her an offer, and he was careful about how he made it, because he had seen what bad offers do to good people. It was not a reward, he said. He didn't want her to feel she owed him a story, or that she'd been turned into a lesson. There was a fund, a small one, quiet, the kind that didn't put a name on a plaque, that paid for apprenticeships and trade education and, as it happened, for people who wanted to turn languages they'd grown up with into work they could build a life on. Certified translation. Localization. The unglamorous, essential business of making sure that what one person says is what another person hears. If she wanted it, the fund would cover her training fully, and there would be a place to start when she finished. Real work, not symbolic. And if I say no, Annie asked, then you keep your life exactly as it is, and I say thank you, and I mean it just as much, he said. But I'd rather you said yes. The world's got plenty of people who translate things. It's short on people who'll tell the truth in the room when it's expensive to. Annie looked out the windows, at the river moving slow and gray below. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen. She thought about the $6,318.47. She thought about the 20 minutes and about all the rooms in her life where she'd stayed quiet because she'd assumed no one would listen to a girl from above a bakery. Okay, she said, but not because I feel like I owe you. That's the only right reason to say yes, he said. The Hallman Precision deal was not dead. It was, in the end, better. With Roland Price gone and Deborah Reuter brought on permanently, the two companies started over, slower, clearer, every clause read twice in both languages. Wilhelm Adler, who had nearly walked away believing the Americans were either fools or sharks, came to understand that he had been dealing all along with a partner who would rather lose a deal than win it dishonestly, and that is the rarest kind of partner a 70-year-old man can find. The contract that finally got signed the following spring ran $14,380,000 over its first phase, and it was signed in a plain conference room with bad coffee, which was exactly how Keanu liked things signed. Adler shook his hand at the end and held it, the way old men hold a handshake when they mean it, and said, in careful English, "You asked 3 times to hear the truth." Most men do not ask once. The Ardmore changed, too, in the small invisible ways that matter more than the visible ones. Gerald Voss, the floor manager, who had made his 3-second choice, did not lose his job. Keanu had asked, specifically, that no one be made to pay for a system rather than a sin, but the system itself was rewritten. The hotel quietly adopted a policy, drafted with input from its own staff, that no guest would be assessed by appearance, and that a server's observation about a guest's safety or welfare would be heard by a manager every time, on the record. It was not called anything grand. The staff just started calling it the Brandt Rule, though Annie was long gone by the time the name stuck, and she never knew about it, and that was somehow exactly right. Annie Brandt finished her certification 14 months later. She did not become famous. She did not become rich. She became something better and quieter than either, a person who walks into rooms where 2 languages are pretending to understand each other and makes sure they actually do. She works mostly in manufacturing and medical settings now, the places where a softened clause or a swallowed warning can cost someone everything. She is very good at her job, in part because she has never forgotten what it feels like to be the only person in the room who can hear the truth and to be terrified that no one will listen. She still bakes on Sundays from her great-grandmother's recipe box. She still switches to German when something matters. And once a year or so, a man in a worn leather jacket and resoled boots comes through whatever city she's working in, and they get coffee, and he asks about her grandmother, and he listens. He has never once mentioned the fund, or the deal, or the night at the Ironwood Room. He doesn't need to. They both know what passed between them in. That dining room was never really about a contract, or a fraud, or even the money. It was about a simple, almost unbearable idea that the most important person in any room is rarely the loudest one, and that the whole tragedy of the world is how often we forget to check. There is a moment near the end of an evening, in a room built to make wealth quiet, when everyone at the table believes they have everything under control. The experts are confident. The papers are aligned. The wine is good. And somewhere at the edge of that room, holding a water pitcher, invisible by design, is the one person who can actually hear what's being said. The only question that ever matters, the question this whole story is really asking, is whether anyone at the table will think to listen to her before she has to find the courage to speak. Keanu listened. That was the whole thing. He listened to a woman the room had been built to overlook, and in doing so he reminded everyone watching of something we are all in too much of a hurry to remember. Respect is not a thing you hand out after someone has proven they deserve it. Respect is what you extend before you know anything at all, simply because a person is standing in front of you, and because you have not yet earned the right to assume you understand them. The man in the leather jacket knew that. The man in the midnight blue suit never learned it. And the difference between them was the difference between a deal that nearly destroyed people and a deal that finally honored them. If this story made you stop for even a moment and think about the quiet people at the edges of your own rooms, the ones holding the picture, the ones who hear what no one else is listening for, then it did what it came here to do. Leave a comment and tell me about a time you almost stayed silent and didn't, or a time you wish you had spoken. Tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every comment, and I love seeing where you all are. If this one meant something to you, give it a like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so the next story finds you. And send it to someone who needs the reminder that the truth is often spoken softly by people we've been trained not to notice. We'll see you in the next one. This is a work of fiction created for storytelling and educational purposes. The character of Keanu Reeves is used fictitiously in an entirely imagined scenario and does not depict any real event, statement, or business dealing involving the actual person. All other characters, companies, hotels, restaurants, and events depicted are invented, and any resemblance to real people, living or deceased, or to actual businesses or events is coincidental. This story is intended to explore themes of human dignity, attention, and the courage to tell the truth, not to make claims about any real individual or organization.